Welcome, viewers and listeners, to CHP Talks. I'm here with another exciting guest today, Mr. Jonathon Van Maren. And Jonathon is a columnist, an author, a speaker, a podcaster, and an activist. Jonathon's writings have been translated into more than 6 languages and published in the National Post, National Review, First Things, The Federalist, The American Conservative, The Stream, The Jewish Independent, The Hamilton Spectator, Reform Perspective Magazine, LifeSite News, and Life News, among others. He is a contributing editor to the European Conservative. His insights have been featured on CTV, Global News, and the CBC, as well as over 20 radio stations. He regularly speaks on a variety of social issues at universities, high schools, churches, and other functions in Canada, the United States, and Europe. He is the author of The Culture War, Seeing is Believing, Why Our Culture Must Face the Victims of Abortion, Patriots, The Untold Story of Ireland's Pro-Life Movement, Prairie Lion, The Life and Times of Ted Byfield, and he is co-author of a guide to discussing assisted suicide with Blaise Allain. Jonathon serves as the communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, and he also manages a website with a blog, podcasts, interviews, and articles that can be found at thebridgehead.ca. In my opinion, he's a wonderful writer, a thinker, a great contributor to the necessary discussions about culture and social issues in Canada today. Jonathon, welcome to CHP Talks.
Thank you so much for having me, Rod.
Yeah, well, it's a great pleasure. I followed you, of course, for years. I think the first time we met was at the threefold what would we call it? The threefold chord event in Langley. We had you, Mark Penninga, and John Dykstra, as well as our former leader of the Christian Heritage Party, Jim Natchik. And that was the first time I met you. And of course, I've seen your progress since then. You've doing tremendously. And just want to ask you, first of all, you can introduce whatever you want to say along the way here, but how long have you been involved? I don't know if that was the beginning of your career there, or if you had already been involved for some time in writing and advocacy.
Well, if I remember correctly, that was in 2008, which would be very close to when I first started off doing pro-life work on campus. And I was asked to speak for maybe 10 minutes or something like that on what we were doing at the Students for Life Club at Simon Fraser University and the clubs, in that Vancouver area at UBC and things like that. I think that was the first or second time I'd ever spoken on the abortion issues. That's probably right around the very beginning.
Yeah, I think it was Mark Penninga from ARPA who suggested we contact you. I'm not sure that I knew about you before then, but we really appreciated that gathering of hearts and minds for that event. It had to be, it could have been the fall of 2008. I think it probably had to be 2009 because Jim Natchik was elected leader in the fall of 2008. So, yeah. And what inspired you? I don't know, for instance, where you were born, but what led you to get involved, motivated? We don't do this kind of stuff for money. We we do it because we're passionate about an issue. And what inspired you in that direction?
Well, I was born in Seattle, but I was raised in the Fraser Valley in Chilliwack, and the reason I got involved in the pro-life movement to begin with, and the pro-life movement was kind of my entry into all of the social and culture war discussions, was when abortion began coming up consistently in my university classes. I'd never really thought about abortion much before. I would have identified myself as pro-life, but I would have been passively pro-life, like most Christians are. And then to, research a few different arguments to use in my university classes to defend the position I'd grown up with, I stumbled across an abortion video. And I watched an abortion get performed from start to finish. And that video featured a baby being systematically torn in pieces. I can still remember pretty much every frame of that video. And it's not an exaggeration to say that video, that baby, changed my life entirely, because it gave me an entirely different view of the country I'd grown up in. Because I grew up in a religious community, a pretty tight-knit religious community. And I think for those of us who grew up in communities that quite successfully kept the mainstream culture at bay for so many years, we were kind of living in these little pockets that were still, at that point, largely unaffected by the social changes going on around us. So I could have a childhood that largely resembled my father's childhood. Nowadays, of course, that's much different. But going to university introduced me to the fact that the culture around me was actually a culture almost entirely shredded by the sexual revolution, that the privileges I'd grown up with had not been enjoyed by the vast majority of my peers, and that the beliefs that I took for granted had not been rejected recently, but had been rejected in Canada by most people 2 generations ago or more. And so that discovery really changed my view of the country that I lived in. And I guess I've never really looked back.
Yeah, well, that was quite a springboard into what you've been doing now for all these years since then. Um, and I just want to comment, you really built a solid reputation among, pro-lifers and pro-family groups. You're highly respected, and your
Thank you.
writings are fantastic. I just want to stress that you do a great job of articulating, the reasons why all the rest of us are doing what we do, right? So
I
appreciate that.
appreciate it.
So what is CCBR? You are the communications director for Canadian Center for Bioethical
Reform. Yeah.
Reform. Yeah, and can you talk about that a bit? We've known a number of people who have
Mhm.
young people who have gotten involved in that, and they're always very excited about their work. But tell us what happens at CCBR.
So the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform was founded back in the early 2000s by Stephanie Gray and Jojo Ruba. Stephanie Gray is now married and living in the US and still does pro-life presentations. Jojo Ruba, many of your listeners and viewers might know, is involved with an organization called Free to Care, combating our government's dangerous stance on things like the so-called conversion therapy ban. So they're both still involved in the movement in different aspects and in different places. And when I was in university working with Simon Fraser University Students for Life, they came to my campus to do some presentations and invited me to attend a pro life display in Florida, where we were going to speak with students with these large displays of abortion victim photography so that we could persuade them to become pro life. And my first days out on campus were so incredibly powerful and empowering. And the reason I found them so empowering is because speaking with people, I realized how many people who are pro choice can be persuaded to be pro life simply by showing them what happens when an abortion happens and by giving them the very simple arguments backed by science, backed by philosophy for why human beings in the womb have the right to life and why abortion violates that right. And the reason I think that it really set my trajectory is because many people in my generation grew up hearing that the world was going to hell around us. And I remember, as a teenager, hearing a lot of these conversations and feeling very dispirited by this. And in many ways, the pro life movement gave me encouragement and optimism, which is probably not the sense that many people get from the pro life movement. But it made me realize that we don't have to wait for politicians to reopen the debate. We don't have to wait for cultural elites to change their mind. We can go to the streets, we can have conversations, and we can see people change their minds, cancel their abortions, join the pro life movement. We don't have to wait for anybody to do the hard work that it takes to begin changing our country from the grassroots up. And so I think when I went to Florida in 2010, that's more or less when I decided that I was no longer going to pursue a master's degree, but I was going to go into the pro life movement full time, which I did in 2011 after I graduated. And the small group of us in the Calgary office there sat down and worked up a national plan to start reaching millions of Canadians with the truth about abortion through our truth trucks, which have abortion victim photography on them, through our street displays, through postcards door to door. And we launched that plan in 2012 when about 20 of us went across the country from Vancouver, from the art gallery, all the way to Ottawa on Canada Day. We did a do-over of the 1970 abortion caravan that
Right.
fight for abortion rights in Canada. And since then, we've just seen explosive growth. And I believe the reason so many young people join CCBR either on staff, we have more than 20 staff members, or join one of our internships in Calgary or Toronto, is because it's empowering, because it's not depressing, because it's not something that you join and you feel, wow, our society's so filled with darkness. Because yes, that's true. And out on the streets and on the campuses and at the high schools, you witness that darkness and you come face to face with it. But you're also part of a solution that you don't have to wait 10 years to see. When you go to the streets for a couple of days, you realize that the impact you had was immediate, that people changed their minds that day, that people changed their minds the following day. And so there's something about the ability to actually watch this work blessed in real time that I think has been a huge draw for young people who are watching their culture disintegrate around them and are tired of hearing that the world they were born into and the world they hope to raise their children into is just simply falling apart and there's nothing that can be done about it. And so we always joke that when the politicians say the abortion debate is closed, our response is, that's fine, we started without you.
Yeah. Well, I often say when some politicians say we don't want to reopen the debate, I said it's never been closed. It's wishful thinking on their part to think that we're going to forget about the precious lives that are being sacrificed every day. Yeah, we're having our local pro-life group in northern BC, where I live. I had a meeting last night. I've been involved with that group for a couple of decades, but we are having Leah Malusas, you know her, I'm sure, speak to us. And, she's an amazing young lady, but she was amazing. Well, from birth, of course, all of us are amazing in our own unique way. But at the age of 12, she became a video sensation. Her speech about protecting the unborn, went viral. And so people who think that they have to get a little older before they can get involved or they have to get settled or whatever, she started moving mountains at the age of 12. And so that's quite encouraging. We look forward. I have met her in Ottawa since then, but now she's a lawyer, I guess, or and carrying the debate to a whole new level there. So, and I'll just tell you that the young people that we know that have gotten involved with CCBR, like we've known them before and after, and they have matured dramatically over a summer's internship with CCBR. They've gained knowledge, skill, and self-confidence in dealing with people on some very difficult questions. It's never it's not a piece of cake to walk out on the street and start talking to people who have deeply held convictions that are contrary.
No, our programs really are a transformative experience in many ways for precisely the reasons that you said, but also because I think that a lot of young people are trying to figure out where they fit in everything. There's an interesting line from the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who wrote the book After Virtue. And he noted that when he looks around at a world kind of torn apart by the sexual revolution, he's tempted to ask himself, what story am I in anyway? And I always think that a lot of young people are looking for, like, what story do I fit in? And when it comes to looking at the post-Christian West, and Canada is very definitively post-Christian in every single way, slowly but surely metastasizing into anti-Christian, a lot of young people are looking to be part of a story that involves rescue, that involves ordinary courage, that involves doing things that make a real difference, not just with clicks, not just with likes, not just sort of digital slacktivism, but something in which they can create real human connections that save real human lives. And so I always say the pro-life movement has given me a lot more than I've ever given it, because the sense of purpose that the pro-life movement can offer allows people to do something that puts them in the position of being counter-revolutionaries. And it's fundamentally a solution to passivity, and it's a solution to the feeling of helplessness and despair many people feel when they pick up the newspaper in the morning.
Yeah. So talking about helplessness and despair, are you hopeful about the future of Canada? Are you hopeful that obviously we have to have some hope, or we couldn't even get our hands involved, but But where do you see the country going in a best case scenario in the next 5 years?
Well, the best case scenario is pretty grim depending on which angle you look at it. But I say there's a distinction between the suite level and the street level. So if we're simply looking at the upper echelons of society, there's no good reason for optimism when it comes to the public school system, for example, and what it teaches, turning new generations of people into ideologues year over year. The only reason that our liberal government is so enthusiastic about bringing in 800,000 immigrants from predominantly traditional societies every year is because they know that all the children of those immigrants will get put through the public school system and then 4 years of university, and that by the time they're done, any residual values they held on life and gender and family will be gone. So I don't think from an educational perspective that we have anything to look forward to. I think that the universities are far worse than when I went. Transgenderism was a niche issue when I graduated from Simon Fraser University, which is one of the most liberal campuses in the country, in 2010. And so we're already seeing, and it's increasingly difficult to attend a secular university and not be forced to participate, say, in the declaration of your pronouns and all these things, where people are being forced to kind of participate in these rituals that inherently support an ideology that most of us would reject entirely. From a political perspective, it's very, very difficult because obviously the political turmoil of the last several years have produced a whole bunch of different issues that aren't necessarily about social conservatism, but at the same time have been deeply worrisome to a lot of people because they see the expansion of state power, what the government believes that it can do with regards to individual freedoms. For me, the most important political priority, bar none, is stopping the expansion of assisted suicide to people suffering from mental illness. Many of the people I love the most suffer from mental illness. I think that's probably true for most Canadians. And if a year from now, or somewhat less than a year now, the Liberal government is in power and ushers in this new regime, the stories that we are going to see are going to be truly agonizing and truly heartbreaking. I don't think anybody's truly prepared for the sheer amount of pain we're going to see from family members who have desperately suicidal and depressed loved ones who can, instead of being taken to the hospital for suicide prevention, will be able to access what our justice minister has referred to as a human right. And so I think the political priority right now is stopping the expansion of this metastasizing suicide regime that began in 2016 and has gone far, far more quickly than any of us could have predicted. And I was one of those that was saying, look at Belgium, look at the Netherlands. I think most of us in the pro-life movement had a pretty good idea of where this would end.
Yeah.
None of us thought it would move as quickly as it has moved, though.
Yeah.
This being the end point was predictable, but the time span in which that's been accomplished, I think, has sort of been a slow motion nightmare. And so, politically speaking, I'm obviously not particularly enthusiastic about the current Conservative Party leader. He used to be pro-life and no longer is. I'm enthusiastic about individual parliamentarians, and I'm sure all of the names I would list are people you would know, people like Arnold Viersen, people like Kathy Wagenthal, people like Ted Falk. There are some very good individual members of Parliament. That list is probably the only ones I would ever donate to. But the party as a whole, I think that it's so imperative that we stop the expansion of the MAID regime, because that is literally a life or death issue in a way that I don't think the majority of Canadians have woken up to yet.
Yeah, no, two things. One, I just interviewed Kathy Wagenthal, by the way, just recently, and her post went up today. And we really support, she is one of my heroes. She's had 3 opportunities to bring forward a private member's bill. Mm-hmm. All of them have been for the protection of innocent human life, and she does it with such good grace and such wisdom, and just so gently she brings forward these very difficult issues. The other thing I wanted to say is, in terms of MAID, well, in BC here on the left coast, they're really pushing. They shut down the Delta Hospice Society, which had a wonderful palliative care unit, and they're so ideologically driven to I'm getting an echo all of a sudden here. They're ideologically driven to have every possible facility cooperating in the killing of the elderly and the vulnerable, that they ignore every kind of human right and even private property rights and whatever. They just stole the facility and turned it over to something else. And we have very few palliative care facilities. One of the problems in Canada, one of the things that leads people into despair when they're facing crisis in their life. But the other thing I wanted to mention, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but Canada has moved so quickly compared to California. We have almost the same population as California. California has assisted suicide, but they don't have nearly the percentage of people choosing that. And one of the reasons, I guess, you may comment on this, one of the reasons is that here the doctors can suggest it. The Veterans Affairs people might say, well, you're miserable, have you considered this? And I don't think they're allowed to do that in California. You may have some other insights into that.
Yeah, there's a few reasons for the distinction. I think that what a lot of people have underestimated is just how post-Christian and post-religion Canada is. Right, you had the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada released polling, I think 2 years ago now, that indicated only 11% of Canadians attend any form of worship regularly. So that wouldn't just be churches; that would also include, mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras, temples. So that means like 89% of Canadians are attending no form of religious worship regularly. It means there's a very, very tiny proportion of Canadians who actually have any view on the sacredness of human life and the fundamental nature of human dignity. And so I think what we're seeing, to a large extent as well, is a crisis of loneliness. We're seeing a crisis with the way that we take care of elderly people, because essentially, as we even discovered to our horror during COVID, a lot of these places are fundamentally warehouses where older people are left to die. They're not being cared for by family members. They're not being attended to by their loved ones in their last days. They're basically, like parked in these homes where they live out their last days cared for by strangers who have no emotional connection to them in most cases. And so what we're seeing is assisted suicide being presented as a solution to many of the individual ills brought about by the sexual revolution. Because the sexual revolution, as Mary Eberstadt often puts it, brought about the greatest explosion of family breakdown in recorded human history outside war or natural disaster. And we're seeing the effects of that now, because essentially, even our political tribalism to a degree, it emanates from the fact that we are no longer part of natural tribes, of parents and aunts and uncles and siblings and cousins. I've got hundreds of cousins. And I got more than 40 uncles and aunts. Like, I have an enormous family. So, if you'd asked me when I was 13, who are you? I would be like, well, one of those people, right? Like, the answer to that question was very, very easy. But the social atomization that we see that assisted suicide is being presented as a solution to is again brought about by the shredding of our social fabric that was initiated by the sexual revolution. So, some of the listeners might chuckle because I always say, bring up a social ill and give me less than 2 minutes and I can trace it back to the sexual revolution. But it was the most devastating and transformative revolution in recorded human history, in my view. If anybody disagrees with me on that, I'd be happy to have that discussion. And the civilization, or the afterglow of the civilization we're currently living in, has no answers to any of the existential questions that people have. And so denied even the natural things that make us want to live, children, grandparents, parents, family members. I'm deprived of even all of those things. Many people are living lives of hopelessness and despair, and a lethal injection does not seem like a bad way to end all of it. And so I think that we're seeing assisted suicide proliferate more in Canada than in other places, because many of the things that give our lives meaning are no longer present in Canada. And that might sound like a pretty grim outlook, but I think that the polling data bears that out. So there are things that we can solve and there are things that we can't solve. We can solve palliative care. I think that would drastically reduce assisted suicide. I think that we can do a better job of ensuring that assisted suicide is not offered to people. But at the same time, I do think that we're seeing a scenario in which the social atomization brought about by the revolution means that for many people, assisted suicide is the best way out. And again, going to university helped me realize that in a way that I hadn't realized it before, because I just assumed like I got parents, I'm one of five, which is a small family for most of the families that I'm part of. I love my grandparents dearly, and the idea that there wouldn't be a day worth living just would never occur to me, because the next day would be filled with people that I love and love me back. But for many, many people in Canada in old age homes, the next day isn't a day filled with people that they love and people who are loving them back. The next day is another grim day in which they're cared for by strangers begrudgingly, where they stay alone in front of a TV for hours on end, and they're living lives of hopelessness and despair.
Yeah. So I certainly agree with that, and I think it is a tragic emblem, I guess, or evidence of what you just said, the sexual revolution, and basically the departure from the concept of family and being the family unit being the center of one's life. You speak to a lot of young people in universities, high schools. If you are speaking to them today, what advice do you give them in terms of they've got to, as we used to say or usually say, they have their life ahead of them. They can go in a number of different directions. Of course, the future is a little darker because of some of the things that have been implemented by our current government, but still young people have choices to make. What advice do you give them in terms of where to put their energy, where to pin their hopes and aspirations on for their role in the future?
So the really sad reality of people growing up today is that the temptations that they face and the availability of those temptations is far worse than I had when I was growing up, and are of such magnitude that I think the people a generation older than me couldn't even imagine what young people face. The first piece of advice that I spend most of my time giving loudly and with lots of statistics and stories is, if you look at pornography, get help and quit. And if you don't look at pornography, take steps to protect yourself. I think digital pornography is the single biggest threat to the communities that the Christian church depends on, to the marriages, to the families that sustain those communities. And pornography has become a pandemic that has swept the church as well, especially in the last couple of years after COVID. At the height of COVID in 2020, Pornhub was getting 4.5 trillion clicks a month, which is double the traffic of Google and Facebook combined. The youngest porn addict I've ever met in the last couple of years from Christian communities was 15 years old. He started looking at it when he was age 5. Stories like that used to shock me. They don't anymore. It is still possible to carve out an existence in which we keep most of the culture at bay. But the difference between now and then is that it has to be done with enormous intentionality. The internet needs to get treated with a great amount of care. Deliberate steps have to be taken to protect ourselves from predatory industries that will get us addicted, that will twist our minds, that will deform our moral sensibilities, and ultimately destroy the relationships that we desperately need to live a fulfilled life. And so these are the decisions that kids shouldn't be making decisions at age 10 that can destroy the rest of their life. But the culture we live in now is profoundly antithetical to innocence and to childhood. And so, unfortunately, what I tell young people when I go to high schools is the decisions you're making now may affect your marriage. The decisions you're making now may affect your family or whether you get one. That's not fair. The fact that this culture is oriented against you living a happy and healthy life isn't fair. But we need to be educated, and we need to be educated so that we can protect ourselves from these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. So you've written a number of books. I don't know which one is your favorite, but are you writing a book now?
Yeah, actually, I was right before you called. I'm working on a sequel to The Culture War, because so much has happened since then. That book came out in 2016. It was my first. And as you know, things have progressed or regressed significantly since then, and there's a lot of new things that need to be addressed. I think I had 3 paragraphs on the gender issue in 2016. Well, since then, the transgender movement colonized society virtually overnight. It took the gay rights movement decades to redefine marriage and to get into the school curriculums. The transgender movement did what they did in 5. So I'm writing a lot of things like that. If I'm talking about favorite books, the 2 favorite books that I've written are Patriots on the Irish pro-life movement and Prairie Line, which is my biography of Ted Byfield. And the reason those are my favorites is because the history books will never tell the stories of our movements and our heroes, because we are, according to them, on the wrong side of history, even though we have 2,000 years and they only have 20. I think I'll take my odds with the Christian Titans the last 2,000 years rather than the sort of the miserable defunct mainline Protestants of today. But the reason I really enjoyed writing those books is because I was telling the stories of people who did heroic and courageous things. The Irish pro-life movement kept abortion out of Ireland for 35 years, saving hundreds of thousands of lives at a minimum. Ted Byfield, who I'm sure you knew personally as well, yeah. I loved writing his story again because when he is referred to, he is referred to in the way the state broadcaster has to refer to him as. He's a bigot. He's a homophobe. If he'd been on the right side of the revolution, they'd have given him the Order of Canada for all the extraordinary things that he's done. But because he was on the wrong side of the revolution and refused to apologize for that right up until the end, he has to make do with a biography written by the likes of me. But what I'm really passionate about is writing the stories of the heroes and the movements that said no. Because as we watch a civilization get swept by this revolution, in every society, at every place where this happened, there were people who refused to go along with it. There were people who bucked the trend. There were people who fought the good fight and accomplished many wonderful things, not least of which was being a witness in a culture that was going to hell in a handbasket. And the thing I loved about Ted Byfield is he reminds me of an anecdote that was often told about G.K. Chesterton. One of the restaurants he would often go to write at, one of the waiters remembers that he would sit down, he would write, he would stop and read what he wrote, and then he would laugh uproariously and keep writing. Very much like the happy warrior who never lost sight of the fact that he was a sinful person in need of grace, never thought he was better than anybody else. You couldn't get through a 5-minute conversation with him without 3 or 4 deprecating jokes at his own expense. But at the same time, he never apologized for the principles that weren't his, but that he felt were eminently worth defending. He always said, Ted Byfield has no new ideas. I just happen to think the old ideas still have merit and are worth defending. And he spent his life doing that. So I really looked up to him, both for what he did, but also for the demeanor and the way in which he did it, because it is so tempting to kind of succumb to bitterness and to always write angrily and to always sort of be, doom scrolling to the next awful story. But what always struck me about Ted, and I think everybody who knew him felt the same way, is that he was such a happy warrior, that he always found so much to laugh about. Chesterton warns that the peril of being a social reformer is that you forget that you're supposed to love what's behind you, not just hate what's in front of you. And that if you fail to enjoy those great privileges and the blessings God has given you, then you've missed the entire point, right? Nobody can save marriage. You can only save yours. You have to enjoy your children, which God has given you. And so I really think Ted is a great example for young writers like myself, for young cultural warriors who want to engage in these fights, because it's not only that he did it, it's how he did it. And so I loved writing that book. I enjoyed spending dozens of hours talking to him. And it was just such an encouraging book to read, because right till the end, I was with him just a few months before he died, where I read most of the first draft to him. And his life was just defined by gratitude. And I think that the essential nature of being a conservative, being a Christian, is gratitude for everything around you. And if that's what the world around us has forgotten too, right? The progressives and the activists aren't grateful for anything. They want to tear down the civilization that gave them everything that they have. They think that everybody born 15 minutes ago was evil and hateful. the woke ideology is in many ways just a sort of inversion of the gospel with no possibility of forgiveness. And so I think that Ted's approach to the culture war is an antidote to all of that. And I try to remind myself when I'm getting worked up to try and write more like Ted would have.
Well, thank you for taking on that project. You've mentioned a couple of my favorite people in history, and Ted, you're right. We did have the privilege of knowing him personally, and we had a visit with one of his sons last summer. Tremendous. So Chesterton and Ted Byfield and Jonathon Van Maren, a writer with some humor and some self-deprecating remarks, but full of wisdom and helping us to understand the world we live in and what we can do about it. I just appreciate what you're doing, Jonathon. Thank you for spending the time with us today. I know that our viewers and listeners are going to really appreciate this interview, so appreciate it so much. Keep up your good work, and we will look forward to seeing what else comes off your pen in the near future.
Well, thank you so much, Rod. Same to you.
All right. God bless you. Take care.